Well, hello everyone, and welcome to Learning from Home, and welcome to the Hewlett-Woodmere Public Library's presentation called Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, More Than Sherlock. My name is Dr. Bill THIERFELDER, and I'll be your host today. For those of you who don't know me, I'm a retired professor of arts and humanities and docent emeritus from the American Museum of Natural History in New York. I live in Portland, Oregon, which is where I'm speaking to you from today, and where I am an artist, writer, and lecturer. But I also return regularly to New York, where I continue my work at the museum and enjoy the wonders of the Big Apple. Now, since we can't cover everything about today's topic in a 75 or so minute presentation, I invite you to take a deeper dive on my website, makingwings.net. And in this case, it's deeper dive number 4. So let me show you and explain. So again, it's Making Wings, one word, makingwings.net. And you should be seeing my website there. This is the home page. And if you go to the upper right corner, you will see what's called a hamburger menu because it's got those little stacks there. If you click on that, you're going to see quite an extensive drop down. Please feel free to visit any of those things, but for today's purposes, go to deeper dives. Don't click on the words deeper dive, click on the downward arrow next to deeper dives. And there you're going to see a few dozen topics. These are all programs that I have either given or will be giving soon. You could visit any of them, be my guest. But for today, it's number 4, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Click on that. And you should now be seeing on your screen, that's what this page looks like. And what you're going to get is a quick overview. And you can go even for a deeper dive by clicking onto that. I got this from Wikipedia. Recommended media. During my presentation, I will be recommending these books, but if you don't have a paper and pencil handy, they're right here on the website, so you don't have to go scampering around. Then I have print resources about his life and about some of his major characters. Some video resources, and then some bibliographies of his work. And those are very extensive. So if you, for example, go to the Wikipedia bibliography, you just click on that, and it will give you the title of every work in chronological orders, the periodical or the publisher, date of publication, I mean, all kinds of stuff. And if Wikipedia has some kind of reference, it'll be in blue and you just click on that and you really can go down the rabbit hole. Now, as is always the case, when you are done, all you have to do is click that off and then you're back on my website. So please take advantage of this. There are all kinds of wonderful goodies there for you. Now, everything that you are going to hear in this program today uses web resources and books that you see on my website. And for this presentation, I especially used the following resources to build both its structure and the script. Wikipedia, the Biography Channel, Britannica, and the very, very wonderful Arthur Conan Doyle Encyclopedia, which is an authorized encyclopedia by the estate of Conan Doyle. Now, as always, one of the things that you'll find on my website is recommended reading and viewing. I just showed you that section. And I'd like to share 3 that I find really good introductions to Doyle. The first is Michael Sims' book called Arthur and Sherlock, which really gives you a nice feel for what inspired Doyle to create one of the most recognizable characters in all world literature. John Carr's biography of Doyle is solid and balanced, and it covers his entire life, including the works that were not about Sherlock Holmes. And if you want some simple viewing pleasure, the Biography channel produced a 46-minute overview of the character Sherlock Holmes that's really engaging. And it's available on DVD and on YouTube. And if my memory serves me correctly, I've also given you a link to it on my website. So all of that brings us to Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's life. Now, I've given you links on my website to very detailed biographies of Doyle. For our purposes today, what I'd like to do is just to give you a few biography highlights. And again, on my website, I recommend the Encyclopedia Britannicus entry, which has many related topics. So if I go to that, hopefully you will see this on your screen. First of all, it even has recent news about Sherlock. Manuscript for early Sherlock Holmes could fetch £1 million. But as you can see, it has everything from the cities he lived in to Sherlock Holmes to you name it. There's all kinds of wonderful documentation. This is a good one too. Sherlock Holmes, pioneer in forensic science. So cool stuff. So you can definitely take advantage of that. But an apt subtitle for today's presentation kind of comes from Doyle himself. I was more than Sherlock Holmes. Though it seems like 95% of everything that's been written about Doyle focuses on Holmes, he actually created many other characters and books of equal quality. Indeed, by the time his life was winding down in the 1920s, he was actually rather saddened that his other work wasn't being given as much serious attention as his stories and novels about the great detective. But let's face it, Sir Arthur Ignatius Conan Doyle, who was born in Edinburgh, Scotland in 1859, into a prominent family with Irish roots, is best remembered today as the creator of Sherlock Holmes, one of the most enduring characters in English fiction. Indeed, Holmes has found his way into movies, television, radio, books, and short fiction thousands of times. In fact, the website for the Guinness Book of World Records hosts this: Sherlock Holmes, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's fictional detective, has the world record for the most portrayed literary human character in film and TV. So let's go a little deeper. Conan Doyle was the second of 10 children of Charles Altamont Doyle and Mary Foley Doyle. Now, as I mentioned, the family was once quite prominent, but the eventual alcoholism and mental illness of his father, who at one time had been a very successful illustrator and artist, caused the family to fall on harder times. And I recommend, by the way, when you go to my website, to click on references to his father. You'll be able to see his artwork and things. He really was very accomplished. Unfortunately, alcoholism took its toll. Arthur began 7 years of Jesuit education in Lancashire, England in 1868. To help with the family income, especially when the father was in asylums, Arthur's mother took in boarders. Through the influence of one of those lodgers, Dr. Brian Charles Waller, Arthur prepared for entry into the University of Edinburgh's Medical School, which you see as the background photograph on your screen. He received Bachelor of Medicine and Master of Surgery qualifications from Edinburgh in 1881 and a MD in 1885 upon completing his thesis. Now, while he was a medical student, Conan Doyle was deeply impressed by the skill of one of his professors, Dr. Joseph Bell. Bell was known for observing the most minute detail regarding a patient's condition. This master of diagnostic deduction became the principal model for Conan Doyle's literary creation, Sherlock Holmes, who first appeared in A Study in Scarlet, a novel-length story published in 1887 in a popular magazine of the time called Beeton's Christmas Annual. There's a picture of Bell in the upper left of your screen, one of several photos that influenced the portrayal of Holmes by artists of the period and after. Now, other aspects of Doyle's medical education and experience appear in his semi-autobiographical novels, The Firm of Girdlestone from 1890 and The Stark Munro Letters from 1895, and in the collection of medical short stories called Round the Red Lamp from 1894. These, by the way, are excellent examples of what Doyle produced besides Sherlock Holmes stories and novels. They also show that Doyle, who focused much, even most of his time on writing, always considered himself a physician. And though he never had anything near what one would call a booming medical practice, he never fully abandoned his medical vocation. Conan Doyle's creation of the logical, cold, calculating Holmes, the world's first and only consulting detective, quote unquote, sharply contrasted with the paranormal beliefs Conan Doyle addressed in a short novel of this period called The Mystery of Clomber from 1889. And therein lies one of the great conflicts of Doyle's life. Conan Doyle's early interest in both scientifically supportable evidence that he certainly championed as a science-based physician, and certain paranormal phenomena such as fairies and ghosts exemplified the complex, diametrically opposing beliefs that he struggled with throughout his life. Now, we're going to talk more of this as we move along. But it's fair to say that one could make a good argument for two Conan Doyles: the scientist who creates Sherlock Holmes on the one hand, and the spiritualist on the other, who believes in the astral bells, psychic powers, and haunting, wrathful spirits that are at the core of the mystery of Clomber. Now, driven by public clamor, Conan Doyle continued writing Sherlock Holmes adventures on and off through 1926. His 56 Holmes short stories were primarily published first in magazines and later collected into several volumes. All but two of those stories, The Adventures of the Lion's Mane and The Adventure of the Blanched Soldier, are related through the eyes of his friend, assistant, and biographer, Dr. John Watson. He also wrote 4 Holmes novels, one of which, The Hound of the Baskervilles, is considered by many to be his Sherlockian masterpiece. Conan Doyle, however, claimed that the success of Holmes overshadowed the merit he believed his other fiction deserved, most notably his tale of 14th century chivalry called The White Company from 1891, and the 1912 novel The Lost World and its skeptical scientist hero, Professor George Edward Challenger. Now, unlike the self-controlled analytical Sherlock Holmes, Professor Challenger is an aggressive, hot-tempered, dominating figure. However, just as Sherlock Holmes is based on a real person, so Professor Challenger is based, in this case, on two people. One was an explorer named Percy Fawcett, who was Conan Doyle's friend. You see him on the left. And the other, a professor of physiology named William Rutherford, see him on your right, who had lectured at the University of Edinburgh while Conan Doyle was studying medicine there. Well, when his passions ran high, and they often did, Conan Doyle also turned to nonfiction. Doyle went to South Africa in 1900 to serve as a medic for the British troops during the Second Anglo-Boer War. In that year, he wrote a book called The Great Boer War, which he compiled from information he obtained from personal interaction with both British and Boer soldiers. In 1902, he also published a pamphlet on the war called The War in South Africa, Its Causes and Conduct, which responded to all the charges leveled against the British for their conduct during the war. Doyle defended the British position in the pamphlet, and this work became so popular that he was knighted in October of 1902. So the reason he is Sir Arthur Conan Doyle has nothing to do with Sherlock Holmes. It was his work as a medic and as a writer about the Boer War. He was also deeply disturbed and outraged by the Belgian atrocities in the Congo during King Leopold II's reign. He wrote The Crime of the Congo in 1909 as an expose of the brutality committed against the native peoples, which included, among other things, chopping their hands off. It's absolutely disgusting, and he was just outraged by that. And from 1916 to 1920, he produced a meticulous 6-volume examination of the British campaign in France and Flanders during World War I. By the way, to anticipate a possible question, Doyle never enlisted in the military. By 1900 and after, he was too old and he was a bit overweight. But he always was on the ready to serve as a doctor in any capacity that he could, whether it was for the military or whatever. He never gave up his medical practice. Now, as far as his love life was concerned, Doyle basically had two families. In 1885, he married Louise Hawkins, with whom he had two children, Mary and Kingsley. Mary, who passed at the age of 87 of age, became a journalist, as well as the manager of her father's psychic bookstore in the 1920s, and more of that in a little bit. Kingsley, who studied to be a doctor like his father, joined the army in 1914 and served as a medical officer. Sadly, he died at St. Thomas's Hospital in London from pneumonia during the great influenza pandemic of 1918. He was buried next to his mother, Louisa, and we're going to talk more about that in a little bit too. After a prolonged bout of tuberculosis, Louisa died in 1906. Now, a year after Louisa's death in 1906, Doyle married his friend Jean Leckie. Now, he had first met her in 1897. She was 23 and he was 38. But he decided to keep the relationship platonic during Louisa's lifetime because he wanted to be, quote unquote, a man of honor. However, between 1897 and their marriage in 1907, Jean and Arthur met many times for walks, parties, birthdays, and visits to the theater. Now, first wife Louisa knew of this special friendship, but was, according to their daughter Mary, very understanding of it. With the second wife, Jean, Doyle had what amounted to, as I said, a second family. There were three children. Dennis was a big game hunter and an auto enthusiast who unfortunately died of a heart attack while on a hunting trip to India. Adrian was also a race car driver like his brother, a big game hunter, explorer, and a writer. He was his father's literary executor after his mother died in 1940. So Jean lives to 1940. But upon her death, he becomes the executor. And when he died in 1970, his sister Jean took over as their father's literary executor. And Jean, by the way, she's right there in the middle there. She went by the nickname Billy. She lived until 1997 and was a commandant in the Royal Air Force. She became Lady Bromett after her marriage to the Lieutenant Governor of the Isle of Man, and in 1963 became Dame Jean Conan Doyle when she was elevated at the Queen's birthday honors. Now, today, 8 family members, nieces, nephews, and great-grandchildren run the estate. And you can explore them and so much more at ConanDoyleEstate.com. And I give you the link on my webpage. We don't have time to go through it today, but it is well worth a visit. You should be seeing it now, the official Conan Doyle estate, and it has information about the family, about licensing, etc. So it's a really interesting place to visit. Go back here. Now, as it turns out, as a result of the emotional impacts of all the family deaths throughout the years, both Doyle and all of his children became avid spiritualists. Indeed, Conan Doyle viewed his most important efforts to be his campaign in support of spiritualism, the religion and psychic research built upon the belief that the spirits of the departed continue to exist in the hereafter and can be contacted by those still living. He donated the majority of the profits from his literary efforts later in his life to this spiritualist campaign. And books include The New Revelation from 1918, The Vital Message, 1919, Wanderings of a Spiritualist, 1921, The Case for Spirit Photography from 1922, and a 2-volume The History of Spiritualism from 1926. Now, Conan Doyle became the world's most renowned proponent of spiritualism, but he faced considerable opposition for his conviction, including, from among others, the magician Harry Houdini and the humanist Joseph McCabe. Even spiritualists joined in criticizing Conan Doyle's book, The Coming of the Fairies from 1922, in which he voiced support for the claim that 2 young girls, Elsie Wright and Frances Griffiths, had actually photographed fairies that they had seen in the Yorkshire village of Cottingley. You can see one of those rather obviously doctored photographs on your screen. Yet somehow Doyle believed, or perhaps better put, wanted to believe. Conan Doyle died in July of 1930, July 7th to be exact. And 6 days later, on July 13th, 1930, thousands of people filled London's Royal Albert Hall for a seance during which Estelle Roberts, a renowned spiritualist medium, claimed to have contacted Sir Arthur. Now, you can see Miss Roberts on the stage. You'll also notice that Sir Arthur's seance funeral packed the massive auditorium, which seats over 5,000 people. Once again, for more detailed information about Doyle's biography, please check out my website, makingwings.net, and choose Deeper Dive number 4. But before we move on to discuss Doyle's publications, there are a few things that I came across while preparing this program that I'd love to toss into the mix. So let's have a brief look at 7 other quick facts. Number 1, in light of all the controversies we hear in the news today, I find this one fascinating. Doyle was a staunch supporter of compulsory vaccination and wrote several articles advocating the practice and denouncing the views of anti-vaccinators. I'm sure this is because he was a doctor. So if he were alive today, I'm sure he would have a few words for the anti-vaxxers. Number 2, we spoke a little about this before, but it's worth emphasizing. Once he was established as a writer, Doyle never fully pursued his medical career, though he always was willing to practice, including during the 6 months as a surgeon in South Africa during the Boer War that we've already looked at. And this tug and pull with medicine is handled quite nicely in Martin Booth's biography, The Doctor and the Detective. It's a very good read. Well, on to number 3. Doyle was an avid sportsman. He was a world-class cricket player, a very competent amateur boxer, and a more than adequate golfer, and a superb billiards player. And he competed in all of these, and he won prizes and everything. You know, what I'm trying to paint here is a very well-rounded man with keen interests and abundant curiosity. In other words, every aspect of life was to be explored. Now, for a man who was a physician and a humanitarian, number 4 should come as no surprise. Doyle was a fervent advocate of justice and personally investigated, not unlike his character Sherlock, he personally investigated 2 closed cases that ultimately led to 2 men, George Idalgi in 1907 and Oscar Slater in 1908, being exonerated of the crimes of which they were accused, respectively, animal abuse for Idalgi and murder in the case of Slater. In both cases, insufficient and circumstantial evidence, as well as inconsistent testimony, had led to a miscarriage of justice. In fact, Doyle's work on the Idalgi case actually helped establish a way to correct other miscarriages of justice, resulting in the establishment of the Court of Criminal Appeals in Great Britain in 1907. So their Court of Appeals in Great Britain is actually a direct result of Conan Doyle's work as a humanitarian, pretty much getting these 2 guys off the hook because they were wrongly accused. Now, number 5 is really a strange one. Some scholars suggested, and this was during his lifetime, that Doyle may have been the perpetrator or one of the perpetrators of the Piltdown Man hoax of 1912, which was later proven to be a counterfeit ancient hominin fossil that fooled the scientific world for over 40 years. The theory of Doyle's involvement has long since been debunked. Now, for those of you unfamiliar with the story, the Piltdown Man was a paleoanthropological fraud in which bone fragments were presented as the fossilized remains of a previously unknown early human. It was promoted as the so-called missing link between apes and humans. The fragments were ultimately found to be the altered mandible and some teeth of an orangutan, deliberately combined with the cranium of a fully developed, though small-brained, modern human. Although there were doubts about its authenticity virtually from the beginning, the remains were still broadly accepted for many years, and the falsity of the hoax was only definitively demonstrated in 1953. An extensive scientific review in 2016, it's not that long ago, established that amateur archaeologist Charles Dawson was responsible for the fraudulent evidence, and any connection to Conan Doyle, who was publicly actually fascinated by the story, was absolutely proven false. The Piltdown hoax is prominent for two reasons. The first, of course, is all the extraordinary attention the hoax generated around the subject of human evolution. And the second is the sheer length of time, 41 years, that elapsed from its alleged initial discovery to its definitive exposure as a composite forgery. Now, number 6, we go back to his son Kingsley from his first marriage. And you see that very nice looking young man over there on the left. For many years, people wondered whether the death of Kingsley from pneumonia as a result of the worldwide flu pandemic of 1918 was the impetus for Doyle's obsession with spiritualism. But the reality is that Doyle's interest was well established long before and well after 1918. The death of his first wife, his younger brother Innes, and other close friends and relatives were all part of an increasing belief that one could communicate with those who had passed away, especially through seances. So yes, Kingsley's death was a major blow to Doyle, but it wasn't the only reason for his spiritualist beliefs. And finally, number 7, none of Doyle's 5 children produced grandchildren. So there are no living direct descendants, only peripheral relations. And when you go to the Doyle estate website, you will meet some of those people, and they're all, great nieces and great nephews and, grandchildren from the nieces and nephews. There's no direct line. On your screen, you see a photo of Doyle and his second wife, Jean, and their 3 children. Dennis on your left, Jean, aka Billy, in the middle, and Adrian on the right. So there you have a potpourri of additional biographical information about Doyle, and once again, much more available on my website, where you can take that deeper dive, number 4. But now what I'd like to do for the rest of our presentation, I'd like to take a look at Doyle's literary output, all the while remembering that through all of his career as a writer, there was also his vocation as a doctor. And we begin with the picture you see on your screen. If I say the name Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, most people will immediately respond with the name, Sherlock Holmes. But there is so much more. Doyle produced 22 novels in his life, only 4 of which are about Holmes. Another 3 of those books are about the equally intriguing character, Professor George Edward Challenger. The rest are all standalone works that Doyle was very proud of. And then there are 204 short stories, of which only 56 are about Holmes. The remaining 75% of his narratives were about a variety of topics and characters, including 16 about an absolutely hilarious fellow named Brigadier Gerard. There were 16 story collections, only a third of which were about Holmes. And to top it off, we have 4 books of war poems, 14 plays, 13 spiritualist books, 10 spiritualist pamphlets, and even one operetta. In 1893, he wrote the libretto for an operetta called Jane Annie, or the Good Conduct Prize, that was co-written with the creator of Peter Pan, none other than J.M. Barrie, with music by Ernest Ford, a student of Sir Arthur Sullivan of Gilbert and Sullivan fame. The operetta wasn't that successful in London, but did very well on a national tour. Now, much of Doyle's work first appeared in The Strand magazine. The Strand was a monthly British magazine that published primarily short fiction, serializations of novels, and general interest articles. It was printed in the United Kingdom from January 1891 to March of 1950, running to 711 issues. Its immediate popularity is evidenced by the initial sale of its first edition of nearly 300,000 copies. Sales continued to increase in the early months before settling down to a circulation of almost 500,000 copies a month, which lasted well into the 1930s. And until his death in 1930, Doyle was one of the magazine's stars. Between 1891 and 1930, Doyle published 121 stories in The Strand, along with 70 articles, 9 serialized novels, 2 interviews, and 1 poem, with Brigadier Gerard, Sherlock Holmes, and Professor Challenger's stories becoming favorites with readers. There were other series in The Strand that also became popular. Once a month in 1898, for example, Doyle produced 12 tales of suspense and adventure, of the mysterious and the fantastic. Murder, madness, ghosts, unsolved crimes, diabolical traps, and inexplicable disappearances abound in these 12 narratives. In 1908, Doyle added 5 more stories, total of 17, and published a collection called Round the Fire Stories. See a copy of that over on your right. But it was in The Strand that most of those Goosebumps stories saw their first light. Now, surprisingly, this collection is out of print, but you can find used copies online. My edition, it's the picture you see on your screen, is actually a discontinued library book from Wilmington, North Carolina, that I was able to purchase through where else? Amazon. The 3 Strange Studies from Life from 1901 are all that Doyle completed of a proposed 12 pieces for the Strand magazine. But in the 3 narratives that we do have, he addresses issues of criminal motivation, public reaction to violent crime, and their effects on trial judges' objectivity. A topic that's in the news these days, isn't it? Once again, the best place to find them are online in collections like the one you see on the right of your screen. Again, it was one that I picked up through an online bookstore. It's really a shame that we have to dig around to find these stories. They're really just as well written and engaging as the Sherlock Holmes stories. Well, if you'd really like to sample something other than Sherlock Holmes, I recommend Brigadier Gerard. He's the comic hero in a series of 17 history-based short stories, 2 story collections, and a play. Brigadier Etienne Gerard is an officer in the French army during the Napoleonic Wars. Gerard's most notable attribute is his vanity. He is utterly convinced that he is the bravest soldier, the greatest swordsman, the most accomplished horseman, and, oh, indeed, most gallant lover in all of France. Gerard is not entirely wrong, since he displays notable bravery on many occasions, but his self-satisfaction undercuts his attributes quite often. Obsessed with honor and glory, oh, he's always ready with a stirring speech or a gallant remark to a lady. Now, Doyle, in making his hero a vain and often rather uncomprehending Frenchman, he was able to satirize both the stereotypical English view of the French and, by presenting them from Gerard's baffled point of view, English manners and attitudes. It's delicious satire, especially if you have some background in English or French history. And even if you don't, the stories are quite droll and may surprise you. They're quite different from his mystery or detective fiction. Now, another aspect of Doyle that most readers aren't aware of is his poetry. He published 4 collections in his lifetime: Songs of Action in 1898, Songs for the Road in 1911, The Guards Came Through in 1919, which was his contribution to an onslaught of British war poetry that was written after World War I, and in 1922, his collected poems. Now, stylistically, many of his poems are ballads, in other words, poems that tell a story. Some of his principal narrators are common soldiers, hardworking laborers, and the denizens of rural communities. But like some of his stories, several poems are intended to create a sense of mystery, such as this poem called A Tragedy. Who's that walking on the moorland? Who's that moving on the hill? They are passing mid the bracken, but the shadows grow and blacken, and I cannot see them clearly on the hill. Who's that calling on the moorland? Who's that crying on the hill? Was it bird? Was it human? Was it child or man or woman? Who was calling so sadly on the hill? Who's that running on the moorland? Who's that flying on the hill? He is there and there again, but you cannot see him plain, for the shadow lies so darkly on the hill. What's that lying in the heather? What's that lurking on the hill? My horse will go no nearer, and I cannot see it clearer. But there's something that is lying on the hill. It's an intriguing poem because it never quite explains the title, does it? A tragedy. Some tragic event has happened here, perhaps, and this particular moorland has the shadows and the strange voices to prove it. But what was it? A war, a famine, disease? All of that is left to our imagination. And just as Doyle was capable of creating humor in his Brigadier Gerard stories, so he was able to do the same in witty poems like A Parable. The cheese mites asked how the cheese got there, and warmly debated the matter. The orthodox said that it came from the air, and the heretics said from the platter. They argued it long, and they argued it strong, and I hear they are arguing now. But of all the choice spirits who lived in the cheese, not one of them thought of a cow. Of course, a parable is a story intended to teach a lesson, often using metaphorical people, places, or things to represent real life situations or people. So in this humorous poem, the narrator presents us with quasi-intelligent cheese mites debating the origin of their cheese, all the while completely overlooking the most obvious answer. Doyle invites us to think about some of the people we know who might be like those mites: intellectuals, politicians, scientists. There are probably many candidates. And then there are the 13 spiritualist books, such as The Case for Spirit Photography from 1922, The Coming of the Fairies, also in 1922, And the last work published in his lifetime, The Edge of the Unknown. The book was published on the 20th of June in 1930, and as I mentioned to you early, Doyle passed 3 weeks later on July the 7th. Now, that last book, The Edge of the Unknown, is a collection of essays and articles written primarily in the 1920s about the afterlife, psychic powers, and ghosts. And the first essay is about Harry Houdini, with whom he shared a very tenuous friendship. Houdini saw spiritualists and mediums as frauds. In fact, he went around trying to debunk them. While Doyle saw magic, like Houdini's, fairies, and other supernatural creatures as an actual reality. Doyle spent much time and financial resources promoting spiritualism, including the opening of the Psychic Bookshop in London in 1925. You can see it there on your screen, the inside and the outside of it. What I'd like to show you now is it's so much fun. It's a 77-second long, it's a very short home movie dating from 1925 that shows his daughter Mary and some employees in front of the store with a cameo by Sir Arthur himself. Now, we don't have to worry about sound levels because it's 1925, so it's silent. So hopefully this is going to open up. There it is. So, home movie, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle style. So here you have Doyle's daughter, Mary. You see her over on the left from the first marriage. Okay, and a couple of other workers from the store. Okay, that's fun. And then here you see Doyle on the left with those workers from the store. This is 5 years before his death. And then you have Doyle with his daughter. The daughter there is on the right, Mary from the first marriage. And then this one is interesting. You're going to see it shift to a view from inside a carriage near the store. And you could see it's a combo of horse-drawn carriages and automobiles in 1925. And then here are more views of workers outside of the store. It's always fun seeing these things, isn't it? So let me go back to here. So as you can see from the two photos on your screen right now, this was not some tiny little storefront operation. This was a major bookshop supported financially by one of England's great writers who firmly believed in the realities of the paranormal. Well, now let's get into a little more traditional territory. I really recommend the three Professor Challenger novels, especially the first one, The Lost World, which was published in 1912, meaning that it predates Edgar Rice Burroughs' similar novel, The Land Time Forgot, by 6 years. Of course, Jules Verne had explored the theme of a lost world in Journey to the Center of the Earth in 1864, and The Mysterious Island in 1874. But what sets apart Doyle's book, as well as the subsequent novels, The Poisoned Belt from 1913 and The Land of Mist in 1926, is the character of George Edward Challenger, a tall, gruff, bearded scientist inventor whose larger-than-life personality is the complete opposite of the wraith-like, contemplative Sherlock Holmes. Now, in the lower left, you can see the noted actor Wallace Beery as Professor Challenger in the first film version of The Lost World, made in 1925. This 110-minute film, which was pretty long for its time, was one of the first to use a technique. In fact, it was the first to use a technique which today we call stop motion action, to create the dinosaurs of the ancient past. Here's chief animator Willis O'Brien placing one of the models on the miniature set. And here's a scene involving the stop motion dinosaurs. In stop motion, the idea is that you would film a frame or two of, in this case, a dinosaur in one position. You'd stop the camera, then you would slightly move the head or the arms, take a few more shots, move it again, another few shots. And when you put it all together, it gave the appearance of the, in this case, the dinosaur actually moving. It's called stop motion. And here is a bit of wonderful trivia. In April of 1925, on a London to Paris flight by Imperial Airways, forerunner of British Airways, a portion of The Lost World was shown on that flight, making it officially the first in-flight film to be shown to airline passengers. And you could see they even put an advertisement on the side of the plane. It's the world's first aircraft cinema. Love it. Now, the film has been beautifully restored and is available in DVD and Blu-ray formats, as well as streaming on YouTube. Towards the end of his life, Doyle claimed that of all of his characters, it was the adventurous Professor Challenger and not Sherlock Holmes who was his favorite. Well, yet, of course, for millions of readers around the world, they beg to disagree. And it was and is Sherlock Holmes rather than Brigadier Gerard or George Challenger who remains the favorite. The individual stories, there are 56 of them, were put into 5 collections. The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes in 1892, The Memoirs of Sherlock Holmes in 1894, The Return of Sherlock Holmes in 1905, The Last Bow in 1917, and last but not least, The Casebook of Sherlock Holmes from 1927. Now, each of these volumes is full of gems. I'm sure you have your favorites. Some of my favorites are the Christmas holiday story, The Adventure of the Blue Carbuncle, in the first volume, The Final Problem, in which Holmes supposedly dies in the memoirs, The Adventure of the Empty House, in which Holmes is found to be alive, and The Clever Adventure of the Solitary Cyclist in The Return, and a really interesting crime of passion story called The Adventure of the Cardboard Box in his Last Bow, and finally, A Tale of Fraternal Jealousy Run Amok in, and I just love the title, The Adventure of the Sussex Vampire in the Casebook. So if you have a spare hour, any or all of these tales are wonderful, clever diversions, especially on a rainy afternoon or a cold, blustery winter's evening. As far as the infamous story, The Final Problem, is concerned, in an article published by the BBC, Jennifer Armstrong noted that the public reaction to the death of Holmes was unlike anything previously seen for fictional events. There were some reports young men throughout London wore black mourning crepes on their hats or around their arms for the month of Holmes's death, although some of these stories may have been exaggerations propounded by Doyle's son Kingsley. Armstrong continues, however, readers typically accepted what happened in their favorite books, and they moved on. Now they were beginning to take their popular culture personally and to expect their favorite works to conform to certain expectations. In other words, Sherlock Holmes is being treated as a living, breathing person, not just the creation of an author's imagination. Pressure from fans eventually persuaded Doyle to bring Holmes back, writing The Hound of the Baskervilles, which is actually set before The Final Problem, and reviving him in The Adventures of the Empty House, which was included in The Return of Sherlock Holmes, the title of that collection. It kind of gives it away, The Return of Sherlock. Now, part of the bring back Holmes craze was ameliorated when the noted American actor William Gillette brought the detective to life in a stage play simply called Sherlock Holmes in 1899, 2 years before the 1901 reappearance of the flashback novel The Hound of the Baskervilles in the Strand, and his official resurrection in The Adventure of the Empty House in 1903. So this is 1899. Now, the background for this play is really interesting. Recognizing the success of his Sherlock Holmes character and the blowback from the character's death, published in December of 1893, Doyle decided, rather than writing a novel or a story, I'm going to write a play based on Holmes's life. Well, after discussions with the American producer Charles Frohman in 1899, Doyle was indeed inspired to pen a 5-act play featuring Holmes and Professor Moriarty. Well, upon reading the play, however, Frohman, the producer, felt that as it was written, it really wouldn't work well on the stage. It might work well as a novel or a story, but I don't think so. But instead, he says, okay, I have an idea for you, Mr. Doyle. I know an actor and a successful playwright. His name is William Gillette. And I'm betting that he would be an ideal Holmes and would be the perfect person also to rewrite the play. Well, to help persuade Sir Arthur, Gillette, the actor and playwright, for his interview, donned the deerstalker cap and a caped coat to visit Doyle, and he officially requested permission to do the rewrite and to perform the leading role. Well, Doyle must have been very impressed by all the effort because he agreed. And after 3 previews, it premiered on Broadway in the November of 1899 at the Garrick Theater in New York City. It was an immediate success and became a signature piece for Gillette, who revised the play several times over the years and performed the title role over 1,300 times through the late 1920s. Now, on your screen, you see several photos of Gillette and cast members from the original 1899 Broadway run, including the intriguing one in the lower right that shows him with his syringe about to inject his famous 7% solution of cocaine. By the way, it's a great little movie called The 7% Solution. Now, of course, in addition to the 56 stories, there are the 4 novels. The first appearance of Sherlock in A Study in Scarlet, 1887. The Sign of the Four in 1890. The Hound of the Baskervilles in 1902, which many consider Doyle's finest work, though Doyle himself didn't, and The Valley of Fear in 1915. Now, in the 28 years between the first and the last novel, Holmes grew more and more emotionally complex, along with his relationship with Dr. Watson. Now, if you enjoy the stories, I think you'll appreciate the detailed and nuanced novels. Let's take a more in-depth look at each of these. A Study in Scarlet is the first Holmes novel written by Doyle, and as I have told you, it was first published in Beeton's Christmas Annual in 1887. Doyle wrote the novel in 6 weeks' time between March and April of 1886. When he was writing it, the working title was A Tangled Skein. A net, right? A skein is a net. A tangled skein. And he named his characters. I like this. The detective was Sherringford Holmes, and his biographer and friend was Ormond Sacker. But before publication, he changed the names to, thank goodness, Sherlock Holmes and John H. Watson. The second part of the novel was eventually adapted for stage as a play called Angels of Darkness, a play in 3 acts by Conan Doyle himself in 1888. Doyle was commissioned to write that second novel, The Sign of the Four, over a dinner with Joseph Stoddard, managing editor of the American publication Lippincott's Monthly Magazine, in August of 1889. Stoddard wanted to produce an English version of Lippincott's magazine with a British editor and British contributors. The dinner that Stoddard held was quite a gathering of people, including Oscar Wilde, who eventually contributed The Picture of Dorian Gray to the July 1890 issue. I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall at that dinner party. Well, the novel The Sign of the Four first appeared in the February 1890 edition of Lippincott's as The Sign of the Four, appearing in both London and Philadelphia. The British edition of the magazine originally sold for $1 and the American for 25 cents. Surviving copies are now worth several thousands of dollars. Now, the novel was published in book form in October of 1890 by Spencer Blackett, using the foreword title, The Sign of Four. The actual text of the novel nearly always uses the sign of the four, the 5-word form, to describe the important symbol in the story. Don't want to give anything away. Although the foreword form is used twice by one of the characters, Jonathan Small, in his narrative at the end of the novel. Well, as was the case with A Study in Scarlet, The Sign of the Four was not particularly successful to start with. It was a moderately successful book. It was the short stories published from 1891 onwards in the Strand that made household names of Sherlock Holmes and his creator. In other words, it's the success of the stories that gave real life to the original 2 novels. The Hound of the Baskervilles was originally serialized in the Strand magazine from August of 1901 to April of 1902, and it tells the story of an attempted murder inspired by the fearsome legend of a diabolical hound who has supernatural origin. This was the first appearance of Holmes since his apparent death in The Final Problem. The success of The Hound of the Baskervilles led to the character's eventual revival. Doyle kind of relented and says, okay, I'll write more stories. Now, on your screen, you see the wonderful Basil Rathbone as Holmes and Nigel Bruce as Watson. They played their roles 14 times between 1939 and 1946. The Hound of the Baskerville films, which is the first, dates from 1939. And it is Rathbone in that film who utters the famous phrase, "Elementary, my dear Watson," which is a phrase that never once appears in any of the 56 stories or 4 novels. It's pure invention. It was also Rathbone who used the smaller pipe for practical reasons. It hid less of his face on screen. Of course, the pipe is another part of Holmes's mythology. Almost all interpretations of Sherlock Holmes include his tobacco use, and yet his most iconic prop, the enormous pipe, the calabash gourd with meerschaum bowl, also never appeared in any of Doyle's original writings. Now, before we leave the slide, I want you to note Doyle's meticulous handwriting on the right. This is a page of the manuscript of The Hound of the Baskervilles. Now, I chuckle every time I see this. Conan Doyle may have been probably the one and only doctor on the planet who actually had neat handwriting. That's definitely a doctor joke. Now, the Valley of Fear the last of the the last of the Sherlock Holmes novels, is loosely based on the Molly Maguires, an Irish 19th century secret society active in Ireland, Liverpool, and parts of the eastern United States, best known for their activism among Irish American and Irish immigrant coal miners in Pennsylvania. It is also based on the real-life Pinkerton agent James McParland, an American private detective and labor spy noted for his success against the Molly Maguires. The novel was first published in the Strand magazine between September 14th and May of 1915. So, there you have it. An intriguing, multifaceted man, truly a polymath. Once again, for more background, just go to makingwings.net and choose Deeper Dive number 4. And while it was obvious that I had to discuss Doyle's Sherlock Holmes, I also wanted to introduce you to the other aspects of this man's creative output. Indeed, most of that output had nothing to do with the great detective. And we cheat ourselves if we only taste that one flavor. So I hope you see today's presentation as an invitation to explore the other Conan Doyle, the spiritualist, the humanitarian, the poet, and the creator of the amusing Brigadier Gerard and the vociferous genius, Professor Challenger. So, before we talk about next month's presentation, this is a great place to discuss your thoughts and ideas. Thanks very much.
Hello, Dr. Bill.
Hello.
Yeah, it's Larry. And as I always say, informative and entertaining,
Thank you.
as usual. Really not 3 questions. Just kind of things I don't know if you ever want to include. The Bob Kane, the cartoonist, he patterned Batman after him. It was really like a composite character, half Arthur Conan Doyle and the other half Zorro.
Uh-huh.
And that's where he's able, and he became like a protege too, like in
Yeah.
the early Detective Comics.
Mhm.
That's where he poured over all of his novels and everything. And what also happened is the first 11 comics books, detective comics, he became too much of a dark character. So Bob Kane invented Robin to
Right.
be like to appeal to children. So he sort of like was his Dr. Watson.
Right. Right. Yeah.
So, and also you're talking about him dying when Superman was supposed, he's killed off in 1992. There had been such a public furor,
Right.
it's the greatest superhero. How can you? So it took like almost a year before they resurrected him. And one last thing, if you're interested, like in cartoons, um, the Daffy Duck and Porky Pig did a cartoon called Deduce, You Say. Deduce,
Yeah. Yeah.
comedy, you say, where he where Porky the Daffy Duck plays Dorlock Holmes, and who's a bumble. He's an absolutely bumbling detective, and Porky Pig plays Watkins. But he's the smart one. He's the I don't want to give away the premise, but it's if you
Sounds
like,
funny.
Warner Brothers
Yeah. Yeah.
Looney Tunes,
Yeah.
if you want to watch that or recommend that, it's a hysterical parody. So
Thank you very much, Larry. Of course, what you're